It's 2020 and currently the world is experiencing a crisis like never seen before. The coronavirus has rapidly spread across the globe, collapsing industries, hospitalising thousands of people and resulting in many fatalities. It is now that we've decided to start the Skadi Podcast to help those in the financial services navigate this very uncertain future. In our first episode, Nick and Claire discuss some of the ramifications of what's currently going on. If you like this podcast, don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends.
But Nick, you've obviously throughout your career been involved in some crises or been part of crises before. How is this crisis any different to the crisis you've been in the past?
Well, I think you're right. I think myself, I think I've traded through about 6 major crises in my career. And that's the same for a lot of the Skadi staff. They're all very, very experienced front office professionals. I myself, aside of a career in London, had a career in Asia as well. And Asia went through a significant crisis in 1997, for example, which was a whole regional crisis, a kind of whole systemic crisis. And that has some resonance for what we're seeing at the moment. But I do feel what we're seeing at the moment is unprecedented. This is, uncharted territory for everybody. And I think that's the biggest challenge for, the medical professionals that are dealing on the front line, but the politicians that are having to make very difficult policy decisions, and the central bankers are trying to do what they can to support the system. But the rate at which, fear went through the market in the last 14 days was actually much more reminiscent to me of the Russian crisis in 1998. That was a very specific crisis involving Russian debt, GKOs. I at the time was trading country funds. And what was so amazing about that crisis is that, and as I've sort of seen this market behavior here, where people don't really know they're in a falling market until they're in one, and people are there trying to pick the bottom, looking for the bounce. And, that's why we've seen such horrific moves in the marketplace. At the moment, there's been a lot of leverage unwinding, and you get these absolutely catastrophic moves, which is very similar to the Russian market back in 98. I think from memory, I was trading the RTX futures that I sold from 600 all the way down to 60, hedging my book of investment trusts. I lost a lot of money on the investment trust, but I protected that by being short that future all the way down. And that gives you some indication of how far that market fell in that period. I certainly hope we aren't going to see similar kinds of falls, and we've already had a very significant move down in the marketplace. But I think what's difficult here is that this crisis is evolving so rapidly. For the market to really consolidate, it needs to get the feeling that we have really understood the crisis and got to grips with it and starting to be able to tackle it. And I think that's the difficulty here. That's the biggest challenge at the moment. So this is certainly uncharted. I thought, having traded in the market of 2008, that I'd seen pretty much the worst marketplace that there could have been. And I can honestly tell you, I felt physically sick most days in 2008 when I was trading a book of convertible bonds. And I'm sure a lot of people who were trading at the time will resonate with that feeling. It was really, really awful. And this is the first time I'm sat out of the market in terms of the stock market. But, you and I are seeing this whole crisis in a very different way because we are inside a small business. So that's pretty scary stuff because we've had to make some very difficult decisions in the last couple of days, in fact, to secure the future of our business, or attempt to. And we're also supporting financial institutions We're supporting law firms. We've got people working in expert witness at the moment. We've got people working in investigations in major banks at the moment. And that's been very, very interesting, seeing how that has played out. We normally do all of that investigation work on site with the banks. We've all had to move to a home working environment. Actually, Skadi's used to working that way, because most of the expert witness work we do with the law firms is off-site. We tend not to work inside the law firms. We obviously go to meetings, but generally you're processing paperwork and information and answering questions for the lawyers from home. So that's not unusual for us, but it is different from the perspective of working on the investigation. So this is really presenting new challenges to us, right?
It's certainly presenting new challenges. One of the biggest obstacles that we have had to overcome at the moment is working from home, a concept which is very strange to those who often work from offices.
It's not really a financial risk, but it's an obvious risk at the moment, is that everybody is now suddenly working from home on their home Wi-Fi setup.
Yep.
And there's a big question there about resilience, because you need to have a resilient system, a resilient platform to conduct the business of finance. Finance is a very critical business, and it has to be done effectively and securely. Well, security. How many Wi-Fi hubs out there have some kind of default password setting that no one's really thought about? And yet suddenly we've put the whole of Britain's biggest industry back in their homes on potentially unsecure networks. That's an obvious one. I don't think that's particularly something that Skadi can offer too much value add with, but that to me is like an obvious situation. The other thing is that all of our institutions are set up in such a way that they protect Chinese walls. So these information barriers protecting public and private information. And if you look at, a lot of the insider trading cases, and people think of it as trading, but really it's not so much traders. Quite often it is people that have knowledge of private information, sharing that with their people that they are close to at home, so their wives, their uncles, their aunts, etc. Well, now one of the big risks I foresee is that a lot of this information is actually now in the home among these people, and when you have significant market corrections, when the economy goes lower and times get harder, human beings inevitably are faced with temptation. And I think one of the biggest challenges of this crisis is that it's going to put temptation right inside everybody's homes potentially, or certainly a lot of people that are handling non-public information. And that's a very, very big risk. I think also, as we've talked about the monitoring of staff, but we would be naive to think that the everyday activities of money laundering and so on and so forth are going to stop in a crisis like this. Absolutely not. These are the environments where that kind of behavior can really thrive, because it's so hard to monitor things effectively. It's very difficult to monitor them at the best of times, but particularly now, as we said, we've seen about we talked about the resilience of systems. If you have your control room compliance, your the people that are monitoring prices and so on, and transaction monitoring, if they're not on a robust platform, they're just not going to see a lot of the activity that's taking place. It's going to be very hard for them to monitor. The other thing too, I mean, I don't think actually in a catastrophic falling market like this, it's a concern at the moment, but from everything that the politicians seem to be saying, we are in this, we could potentially be in this situation for a prolonged period. Yeah. And in that prolonged period, if the markets did stabilize, but we all get used to working from home, then you could have the situation where new products are brought to market, and then new product approval processes are going to get tested. And it's very easy to have a new product approval test process within a financial institution when everyone is there sat round the table and you're video conferencing in whatever the compliance officer from New York on a very resilient link. Much harder when you've got a committee of 12 disparate people all operating on home broadband. Are they going to be plugged in at the appropriate moment to hear the critical information to assess whether a product can be processed, booked by the bank? So we are really going to see a lot of these fundamental processes that I think we take for granted. Really, the theme out of all of this, just going back to where we are, and we can talk about other things that are going on. What we've learned from crises is that really during these times, this is where the contracts that people get themselves into, financial contracts or business contracts, business agreements, they're really put together in the good times, and they only really get tested at times like these. And that's really probably what's going to be the fallout over the next 18 months, is that we're going to have numerous situations where contracts are going to be tested because agreements aren't going to be able to be maintained due to market conditions. And then you are really going to be in a situation where there will be a lot of reliance on subject matter expertise. And Skadi has a lot of experienced people that can offer that kind of expertise in the financial markets. But we also have expertise within shipping, within renewable energy, within mining and resources. And, there have been some significant moves in prices. You look at the oil price that everyone's talking about now, significant move down in prices, looking at shipping, looking at rates, ships lying idle off the coast of China, not able to go into port, etc. Shipping rates have collapsed. These are all going to lead to potential arbitrations and litigations, and these are things where Skadi can really help.
And finally, on a more positive note, we want to share how we help the next generation of financial investigators get ahead of the game.
Because again, it's hard for Skadi, isn't it? Because we are, generally experienced people. So finding ways to reach out to, other people and diversify, the staff at Skadi by bringing in younger and more inexperienced people is quite a challenge to us. So the work experience was quite good for that, wasn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
And you were a big driver behind that. Talk a little bit about the program that you put together for them.
Well, I was conscious that the team at Skadi, we're a small team, and I wanted them to enjoy their work experience. I think all too often people come back and it's a bit boring. I did filing or I did this, and I really didn't want them to have that. I wanted them to get the experience that I got when I started at Skadi. It was interesting, exciting. It was very different from what I've done, the investigations, the trading side, and I wanted them to enjoy it. So we put a program together that was a bit in the office, looking at the rogue trader and the training that we've done for law firms before. Went through that with them. We took them out to a court to look at a hearing and sit in a hearing. So they've got to start the expert witness and how that plays out in court. We took them to a fraud conference. So getting a bit of a feel, we walked around Canary Wharf and explained how Canary Wharf started and why it started, and really sort of engaging them on the whole sort of financial institutes and the market itself, and then how our work goes on after that. So a bit of everything, really, didn't we? A bit of training.
I mean, it is amazing, walking around Canary Wharf, because obviously you can lose yourself in all of the glass and the metal and the granite. But it's the place names of everywhere that you go, and you've got, Cinnamon Wharf and, Sugar Wharf or whatever. And these, it's all about the trading that went, the goods that used to come into the Port of London. And now there's this fantastic financial centre that's built up there. But really, all of that's come about from trade. And then you look further into the insurance sector and the importance of Lloyd's and shipping and so on. And again, it's all about trade. And London has been very, very great at sucking in trade over the centuries. And that's why we have this great financial centre there. And I think taking, a bunch of youngsters to really stand in the heart of that and explain what finance is about is so critical, because I have to say, as someone that, came into I came into Barings actually, Baring Securities back in the 90s. No one actually stopped to talk to me about finance. I was just basically shoved in, and you get on with stuff on the desk and you start doing a process, but you don't really think about that process and you don't think about the consequences of it. And I have to say, that is really, what was one of the reasons why the 2008 crisis came about, was that I think, we didn't give people coming into the markets any kind of moral compass and moral direction, which I think has changed now. I do think that there is a much better tone from the top, and that's been identified within finance. But that really wasn't the case when I started. And I think that was very important for me, bringing in a set of youngsters into the firm, to give them that education that, it's like the education I didn't have. But it really was, a situation like that. And I wanted them to make it aware, because also it's so easy to read negative stuff about finance in the press or whatever, and banker bashing and so on. But actually, finance does so much for our society, so much positive stuff for our society. But actually, if you ask most financial professionals, it's hard for them to even put their finger on that, because all they can think about is making money. And that's the key motivation. And I think that's a wrong one. And I think that's something that we should continuously strive to correct.
So there you go. Thank you for listening to Skadi's podcast, episode 1. And although we are no longer at our home in Canary Wharf, I hope that this series is able to inspire you to evolve your communication within your organisations. Stick with us on this journey, as we, like many of you, are trying to navigate these very uncertain times. This is the Skadi Podcast.